Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Richard Dolan Show, where every time we're here, we fight the good fight. Just as I was finishing the preparation for this program, I received some interesting information from a source of mine, one that I trust, that has some information or description, I should say, of at least some of the classified portion of the UAP Task Force Report. I have to emphasize that I cannot verify this currently. But again, I do trust my source. I will reveal this in the course of this presentation. I actually had to go through the presentation and look, like, where's the best place for me to put this in? It's close to halfway through, so it'll be in about 15, 20 minutes. I'm not trying to tease you with this. I really want this worked in as properly as I can for what I've already prepared for you. So I will get it in there. So be ready for that. It's rather interesting, I will say that. Now, last week, the very long-awaited UAP Task Force Report was released to the public, and as most of you, I'm sure, probably realize, this is something that was, well, first of all, it was placed into the COVID relief bill. It was signed into law by then-President Trump. This is the newly created UAP Task Force that was given 180 days, right, to prepare and to deliver a report on UAP, or UFOs, to the Senate Intelligence Committee, discussing any and all national security implications of these UAP or UFOs. And last Friday, that report was made available to the public. That is the unclassified version. The classified version already having made the rounds. And again, I'm going to talk about that in a minute. The word is that the classified version of the report is something like 73 or 78 pages. The version we get to read, the unclassified, was 9 pages, actually 6 if you remove the title page and then the 2 pages of appendices. So definitely skimpy. Safe to say that probably 99% of the people who follow UFOs have panned this report. Not surprising at all. I myself, I thought, okay, I was expecting something pretty threadbare. Yes, but I have to say, I was expecting more than 6 pages of text, which was shorter than, many middle school papers on the Salem witch trials or why cats and dogs don't get along. I don't know. I mean, this was short. And like all of these government documents, filled with vague bureaucratic jargon, is filled with run-on sentences, and, everything else seemingly designed to put you to sleep while you read it. So that's the report. And moreover, it has to be said, this report did not list a single genuine UAP event. Well, there was the one statement about the lone solved case being a deflating balloon, but I mean, in fact, not one single event was referred to. No dates, no locations, no descriptions of anything. What we got was a paper that essentially told us why the task force needed more money to do its job properly in the future and why reporting procedures had to be improved and so on. Anything to enable these people to avoid drawing any public conclusions on just what UAP or UFOs happen to be. Basically, just more public foot dragging. That's really what we got. Now, although a lot of people really were angry about this, and again, I understand, totally understand why. And there were always folks also who said, yeah, I wasn't surprised. I saw this coming all along. Those people who always pretend that they know everything in advance. Although there were people like that, there actually were, in my opinion, there were a few little potential nuggets contained within the report. I actually do believe this. I talked about these in a paper and in a podcast that's on my website at richarddolanmembers.com. I've got a link below. You can go check it out. It's free. You can just read it. But I'm going to summarize those points for you right now, and then I'm going to move on to some other things. So relating to the unclassified version of this report. So first of all, point number 1, although the authors don't point to any specific culprit as being the main source of these objects, they do state that they didn't find any evidence that any of these were U.S.-derived technology. Point number 2, they found no evidence that any of these UAP came from Russia, China, or any other foreign nation. I thought that was interesting. Point number 3, this report states that these UAP are basically solid, real objects, and they appear to be technological. Point number 4, the report also indicates that these objects have caused a fair amount of havoc during U.S. military exercises and actually have caused a number of near mid-air collisions. Kind of a big thing. And then the fifth point I thought was also interesting, which is that some of these objects apparently are puzzling or maybe even inexplicable, at least in terms of their flight characteristics. They're not easily explainable. In fact, one relevant quote from the report, I'll just read it to you. You don't need to see it on the screen. They stated that some of these objects included the ability, quote, to remain stationary in winds aloft, move against the wind, maneuver abruptly, or move at considerable speed without discernible means of propulsion. All right, end quote. Does any of that sound familiar? If you read UFO reports going back to the 1940s and 50s and 60s, you get the same kind of language in there. Anyway, each of these 5 points that I just mentioned, they're basically scattered throughout the report, so it's very easy for a casual reader just to miss them. They're typically buried within these long-winded sentences and long-winded paragraphs. But I would say these 6 pages, despite how skimpy they are, they actually open up a potential public relations maybe problem for the Pentagon. I mean, after all, look, they're saying right here, if it's not United States tech, military, or industry, if they don't have that included in the possibilities, and it's not a foreign nation, and they appear to be solid, and they appear to be technological, and they cause air safety hazards and potential crashes in the sky, and they're a potential national security challenge, and that's the word they use. They don't use the word threat. They say challenge. And all of that. And then they also sometimes exhibit puzzling flight characteristics. And I mean, look, what are we talking about here? So all of that is in the unclassified report. So as disappointed as most folks in the UFO community are by it, and again, I wasn't expecting a lot, but I was expecting more than that, I have to say as well. But even so, there's information in there that can be worked with in a public capacity, and I would say let us not lose sight of it. Now, the report does leave a very important out, so to speak, and that's in its emphasis on how insufficient that its data is, or at least how it claims its data is. So they're basically saying we studied 144 UFO cases going back to 2004, and they only explained one case. That was the deflating balloon. The other 143 cases are not explained. Of course, they don't mention the cases specifically, but they say they could not explain them. But they also emphasize that this doesn't mean the cases are unexplainable. It doesn't mean that they're alien craft. In fact, they never use the phrase alien craft. They never use the phrase extraterrestrial. It doesn't come up in the document at all. But what they're saying is we can't explain these, but that's simply because we don't have enough information to conclude anything one way or the other. Or at least they leave it open for that possibility. So they've got wiggle room to get out of this, in other words. All right. And in other words, they're saying there's no evidence that, let me put it this way. Although there's no evidence that any of these objects were American made, that doesn't mean absolutely they were not. And just that the authors of the report didn't find any evidence. That's all it means. And the same with Russia or China as the source of any of these. They didn't find any evidence that it was Russia or China, but they didn't definitively rule out Russia or China. At least my reading of that report, they did not rule any of that out. So the only thing they really can't explain away is that these things exist. I don't think they'll be able to back away from that. The fact that they documented 11 mid-air near collisions, that should be enough right there. And then the fact that in 80 out of the 144 cases that they studied, that these UAP were tracked on multiple sensors. That's also in the report. So there's something out there. They're making it very clear, and that this something, whatever they are, is not easily explained. But again, a lot can be walked back. Even like the apparent puzzling nature of these sightings, seems to me that they have the ability to walk this back if they want. You can easily, I think, foresee a scenario in which someone in the Pentagon comes along and says, all right, we've got it all figured out now. These were misidentifications, these were misreadings, or whatever. Doesn't have to be true. If they say it, probably wouldn't be true, obviously. And in fact, I suspect that many of us are expecting some blatant lies to continue to pour out of the Pentagon. I mean, after all, this is an institution that has a long history of interspersing lies into It's public messaging. They do it all the time, and they've done it for generations. So that can happen. But basically, when you're looking at the unclassified version of the report, you're seeing an interesting kind of an in-between stage of in between admission and denial, because this new task force was put on the spot to produce a report, and something had to be put out. It would not have been realistic or even feasible if they had put out a straightforward debunking exercise, like what people got from the Air Force in the 1990s, when the Air Force prepared that ultra embarrassing report on Roswell and explained it all on a stray classified balloon project, Mogul balloon. I don't think the task force today can do quite that level of straightforward, ham-fisted debunking. Too much has been released into the public domain this time. And I cannot see how it would have been possible, really, for this task force to do the same kind of stonewalling that we saw in previous decades. I don't think it would be considered credible by probably anyone at this point. So something had to be acknowledged, is my point. And the fact that a genuine, mysterious phenomenon is being acknowledged, I mean, look, that's a good thing for the rest of us, because at least we're getting that much. Keep in mind that, 5 years ago or more, the world wasn't even getting that. So that's a sign of genuine progress, and I think we should not forget it. However, the other side of all this is the extremely tepid nature of the report as a whole. I mean, tepid, vague, and inconclusive. I mean, this is an exercise in foot dragging. They're taking their time and doing everything possible to avoid generating a conclusion about this, because, I mean, ask yourself, in God's name, what actual conclusions can they generate that are politically safe? Now I want to get into what was leaked to me today. So before I go into all of those reasons why the politically explosive reasons about getting into all this, I want, actually, before I even do that, let me just ask you, if you like what I do, please smash or maybe gently tap that like button. That helps me a lot. And if you like what you see here, please subscribe to my channel, click on notifications. You don't want to miss a new show. And if you really want to see what I'm up to on a regular basis, honestly, go to richarddolanmembers.com. That's where I produce content every week in the form of articles, audio podcasts, video podcasts, and everything like that. Okay. Back to the task force report. Let me think. I'm gonna hold off on the leak. Let me just bring you this leaked information in a second. I have a couple of other things I just want to say here. The question is, would it even be possible for the report to conclude that some of these UAP are U.S. manufactured? Yeah, let me talk about this first. Think about it. Could they actually do it? If so, then there's going to be some serious head rolling behind the scenes. Like, which organization would have been responsible for swarming U.S. battle groups? A couple of folks that I have talked with about this lately, one in particular stated to me that, how do I put this? That, in fact, this is exactly what has been going on, that it's done all the time. When this was told to me just recently, I just thought, so that's the 80 years of the UFO phenomenon boiled down to this explanation: covert testing of American military forces by experimental technology. Honestly, never mind the fact that if there were any experimental flying saucers harassing our installations in the 1940s, we still have not seen them rolled out publicly to this day. But we're told this is done all the time. Done all the time. Here's the thing. I am not aware of a single documented case in our historical record that this, in fact, has been done at all, if it's ever been done. And in other words, we're talking about using U.S. soldiers and sailors as unwitting guinea pigs for advanced technological tests of new gadgets. I'm still waiting for any historical confirmation, even one time, to say nothing about such a thing being actual policy. Now, this isn't to say that the U.S. military hasn't done unethical testing of all different types on its personnel. It has. We know about this. Drug testing, for example, psychological mind control testing. Yes, even testing of bacteriological agents on the general population. One such test was conducted in New York City in the subway system back in 1966, where I lived as a 4-year-old boy. Yes, I know about all of these types of activities and more. Absolutely. But faking or spoofing UFOs to its own military forces, that's not something that we have any confirmed record of anywhere. So, look, it's not to say that it's impossible. It could happen. But just how realistic is that scenario? How realistic is it, for instance, that the so-called drone swarms of 2019 off the coast of California were the result of that? Or the near daily harassment of the USS Roosevelt off the US East Coast in 2014 going into 2015? How likely is it they were the result of this kind of testing? You know, something that genuinely put pilots' lives in danger more than once. I know, it doesn't strike me as realistic. I'm not saying impossible. The fact is, no matter how you look at it, if these UAP encounters were the result of some form of U.S. manufacture and testing, it seems to me that there would be hell to pay, even, under any conditions, if it were revealed, no matter what the cause. I mean, aside from the fact that it would mean the United States government would be telling the rest of the world that, yes, we've got something along the lines of flying saucers, or at least some very, very advanced objects. It's fair to assume no one would want to do that. So there would be many, many angry people for all kinds of reasons if there were any conclusions that this was U.S. tech. And I think for that reason, we will never see such a conclusion. Aside from the fact that it really might not be U.S. technology. It's totally possible. And there's one other very good reason to argue against this being U.S. technology. And then I'm going to get into this leaked information. You see, the thing is, it's easy to think it's U.S. tech if you pretend that the world of UFOs began in 2004, that it all started with the Tic Tac, which of course is absurd. And yet that seems to be the complete national conversation about this phenomenon these days. No such thing as UFOs in the entire 20th century. Well, the fact is we have thousands of documented cases of extraordinary objects interacting with military personnel all through the last century, often tracked carefully with very sophisticated instruments. During the 1940s, we also have strong declassified reports talking about objects being tracked at 9,000 miles per hour and even faster. Keep in mind that people of the 1940s were certainly sophisticated enough to invent, the atomic bomb, radar, early computers, and much more than that. They were certainly able to track UFOs when they had proper equipment handy, which in many cases they did. And back then they also asked, is this part of some sort of secret technology that we're developing? Absolutely, this question was asked. But here's the thing. Not then and not now do we have any hint that we secretly invented flying saucers at that time. There are people who suspect it happened, but there's no evidence. We've got nothing. I have looked and I don't know what anyone else has ever found that points to this. So I think it's very important to keep in mind that some people try to pin all these UFOs on secret tech. And the fact is, people have been wondering this for about 80 years. And I don't see how it's reasonable only to look at the most recent UFO or UAP cases in isolation from the long history of objects that performed every bit as amazing as the ones today. Okay, so now, before I move on to whether or not these might be Chinese or Russian, because I want to talk about that as well, I want to share with you information that was leaked to me just about an hour before I went live. All right. And that's why I had to work this in. So it's a statement. I'm going to show it to you, and I'm going to read it, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it. So this is the text of what was sent to me just a little while ago. I'm going to read it. So this was not written by my source. This was written to my source, which was then sent to me. Quote, the classified portion of the UAP report given to a select number of congressmen and senators relates to the following. 1. Energy Pulse Propulsion System projects, that's EPPS. 2. Ion propulsion systems. 3. Anti-gravity propulsion systems. 4. Antimatter propulsion systems. 5. Ramjet hydrogen propulsion systems. 6. Compressed nuclear propulsion systems. 7. Advanced use of exotic elements for energy research. And then in parentheses, the individual wrote ET-related items. 8, the K-Song Energy Propulsion System Research Project. By the way, that one I looked up because the title seemed odd. K-Song just struck me as odd. And I have not been able to find a source on that. So I don't really know what to say about that. But let me continue, because the second part of this is even a little more interesting in my view. All these highly classified projects are under the control of the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, DARPA, and being managed by a classified group called Advanced Group 6. Advanced Group 6. All funding for these projects is black confidential funds appropriated under intelligence operations costs. Some funds come from private contractors. That's interesting. And then listen carefully to this part. Prototypes of flying crafts utilizing the above technology are being flown at Area 51 and Tonopah Air Force Base test range. Some of the UAPs observed in and around Nevada can be, and this is, I think, a mistaken word, they say contributed, and I think the author means to say attributed. So I'm going to read it correctly. Some of the UAPs observed in and around Nevada can be attributed to crafts using the above propulsion systems. However, and listen carefully to this, please, none of the experimental crafts have flown outside the Nellis test and training range. None of these experimental crafts can be attributed to the sightings photographed by the U.S. Navy. And again, I think the person certainly means attributed, not contributed. So what they're saying here, it seems to me, is that inside Area 51 and in Nellis and in Nevada, there are some very suggestive and advanced propulsion projects that are being worked on, including something that is noted as ET-related. That is advanced use of exotic elements for energy research, ET-related items. All right, that's food for thought. But what the writer of this, the person who wrote to my source, apparently was saying is that it doesn't seem, and this is apparently from the classified portion of the UAP report, it does not seem to the authors of the report that any of the experimental projects that are being worked on in Area 51 are traceable to the UAP reports that they looked at. That's the fundamental, and that's apparently the leaked portion of the report that came to me in that summary form. So interesting. Again, if I'd had more time to delve into it, I mean, this came to me just right before I, went live, and so I actually changed the title of the video for that, and so forth. So maybe this will be something that we'll be diving into more in the future. Now, okay, I think all of that actually speaks in a consistent way, in that the authors of this report do not, they seem genuinely not to believe that these objects are of U.S. technology. But even so, I still maintain that there's no political way in hell that they're ever going to say that these are U.S. tech. That's just way too explosive politically for all kinds of reasons. But it may be the case, at least looking at this leaked information, that they may genuinely think it's not U.S. tech. That's a real possibility. It seems that way to me. Now, let me move on to what I've already prepared here for you. So think of the possibility that these objects are made by a foreign nation like Russia or China, right? I don't see much support for this idea at all, although there was actually a spirited defense of it in an article posted about a month or two ago in the War Zone by Tyler Rogaway. That was a very long piece and argued as well as I think one could imagine, or one could argue the case. His main point was that the recent incursions, like in 2019 and back on the East Coast of the U.S., the Roosevelt, that these took place in areas where the U.S. Navy was well known, like reliably well known to do its battle testing, and that the drone activity detected was very likely from China or Russia with the intent to engage in various kinds of electronic warfare. It's definitely something that all major powers do. And they'll do it to each other for excellent military reasons. I think many people agree that there are valid motivations behind that, and in theory, you could say this is possible. You definitely could. But there are still like many unexplained elements to that theory, at least in my view, mainly in explaining how these objects got right on top of a U.S. battle group so quietly, so close, and still evaded capture and even damage. Like, that's kind of amazing. And also where they would have come from, being very much out at sea. I mean, many miles out of sea. Sure, they could have been launched by a submarine or maybe even a disguised vessel. Okay. But there isn't any evidence for this that we've been able to see. And the technical achievement of doing something like that, I think would be truly disturbing for the U.S. military. Maybe that is the case. And I'm not saying it absolutely could not happen, but it seems rather unlikely to me, and I think to most people studying this. To say nothing of what it would mean if the UAP Task Force Report had concluded that any of these had actually come from Russia or China. Could you possibly imagine the political fallout that would occur from that conclusion? I mean, in the first place, you would have public opinion most likely getting seriously inflamed over this, or at least a good chance of that. I mean, after all, these events were highly confrontational and very close to U.S. territory, you know, close to the shore, like 60 miles off the coast in the case of California. I can't think that American national security authorities or that the political establishment would be inclined just to let this slide if it became public, like they would have to deal with it. You know, you've got major tensions right now with China in the South China Sea. You've got tensions with Russia in the Black Sea near Crimea and in eastern Ukraine and Belarus. No, this would be a nightmarish prospect if the report were to conclude that the Russians or the Chinese were behind these UAP. I mean, political nightmare. But realistically, I don't think most people are taking that possibility seriously anyway. Yes, it should be considered, absolutely. But is it realistic? I just don't think so. I would certainly say no way if you're talking about the 2004 Tic Tac UFO encounter, the Nimitz encounter. In the world of that time, for a variety of reasons, I would say there is no chance in hell that the Russians or Chinese would have been behind that. I would say none. That was a different world geopolitically and in terms of technological capability back then. We're talking 17 years ago. I'm just not seeing it at all. So in other words, there's really no political reason why the UAP Task Force Report would ever point to either U.S., Russian, or Chinese manufacture of these objects. I just cannot see any reason, even if they thought that it was the case, I cannot see any reason why they would ever want to publicize that. But aside from the fact that to many analysts, I think it actually does seem like a stretch at best, especially the Russia-China element of it. So all of this means that the authors of the task force report, I mean, honestly, they were placed in a very difficult position. I'm not defending them here. I'm just really stating the obvious. In all likelihood, and this is simply my guess or assumption, they just would not have been permitted to make any conclusions along those lines, not for the public anyway. So everything's got to be vague. And that also goes, by the way, for anything hinting at that other category, the category of other, that is not American, not Russian, not Chinese, not any other country, other. It's obvious that no one was going to be allowed to make that conclusion either. And this brings me actually to the main point that I was thinking about when I started when I developed this presentation for you tonight. It's the point that I really want to make, which is that for more than 3.5 years, since December 2017, we have been hearing claim after claim by some people that the UFO or UAP information coming out to the public is not really legitimate, or it's not really genuine, but it's part of a psyop, that is a psychological operation by the United States intelligence community. That the purpose of this psyop is primarily to spread fear into the population through the creation of a threat narrative, by spreading the idea that UFOs and aliens are a threat to humanity. And that's, I think in the minds of some people, that's a false idea, and is part of a psychological manipulation. And some people have gone so far as to call this a false flag operation. You even hear people now and then talking about the so-called Project Bluebeam. That's the fake alien invasion scenario that's supposed to bring in a global dictatorship, which, by the way, is happening. We're seeing it happen every day around us 24/7, but not courtesy of Bluebeam. It's just happening. But for the record, I've dissected the Bluebeam narrative multiple times. But any sort of calling our UFO situation today like a false flag, in my view, runs into serious problems of both logic and evidence. So, for example, the idea that there's this false threat narrative, it's actually promoted by two people. There's really two individuals who have discussed UFOs or UAP as a potential threat. All right. And that's Luis Elizondo and Christopher Mellon. And after all, they're actually the only two prominent people who've been bringing this up, as far as I can see. They've done so in several public statements, including on the TV show Unidentified. Basically, they've said at different times that UAP are a potential threat to national security. And then these statements were then taken by different people and interpreted as fear-mongering to scare up the public into running to the military for protection. Create a fake enemy, and therefore you have a manufactured solution. So in 2003, the military did conjure up a scare about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and they used that to justify a ruinous war in that region. And there are people who say that's what's happening here. That's the assumption. Okay, well, let's take a look at how strong this argument is. All right. So it is true. Elizondo and Mellon have sometimes mentioned this phenomenon as a potential threat. Now, in the first place, let's just ask ourselves a simple question. Is this phenomenon a potential threat, including to national security? Now, as someone who has actually studied in detail the long, long history of military encounters with UFOs, and I've done this over many years, I think that I am about as well qualified as anyone that I know to comment on that question. I have no doubt that there are some analysts out there, especially in the classified world, who know this better than I do. But regarding the history of military engagements with these unknown objects, I'm prepared to match my knowledge against anyone. In my 2 volumes of UFOs and the national security state, as well as through extensive study and research, even beyond those books, I found hundreds upon hundreds of dramatic military encounters with UFOs, and a few in which pilots lost their lives, quite a few in which the objects were clearly harassing military aviators, and many in which unknown, mysterious, extraordinary objects were loitering over and invading sensitive airspace, not firing weapons and blowing things up, but certainly engaging in some sort of surveillance or espionage or something along those lines. And not just against the United States military, but the old Soviet military, that is the Russians, and many, many other nations as well. It's been very well documented, and it's in a lot of in my 2 volumes of history and many other works that I've done. Now, the fact that they haven't done an Independence Day scenario and blown up the White House or some other important place doesn't mean that they're not a potential threat. I mean, who on earth is so naive as to think that? Threats can come in many ways. That's the reality. So for Mellon or Elizondo to bring up the fact that these unknown objects are a potential national security threat let me just say this clearly. It's perfectly reasonable. It is perfectly reasonable to bring up such a fact. And denying this is essentially denying that nations have the right to defend themselves. And yes, I believe very likely some of the critics who are calling this a false flag, they might actually feel that way, that the nation doesn't have a right to defend itself. I often get this impression. It's one thing to criticize U.S. global policy and U.S. military actions. I've done that myself many times. But it's entirely a different thing to deny that such a nation has the right to defend itself or has the right to have a military at all. And again, I think some of the critics seem to come very close to that position, which I just don't think is legitimate. And besides, there are, we're talking about military men. Elizondo and Mellon are both, or at least they both worked in the Pentagon system for many years in the case of Mellon. How could anyone imagine that they would not consider the potential threat scenario of UAPs or UFOs? Honestly, failing to consider that would probably be criminal negligence on their part. It's their job. They have to consider threats. And citizens should want them to do that, by the way. Otherwise, why have a military at all? That's the point of it. Now, this is not to say that in any confrontations between the U.S. military and these UAP, like that we always know who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. The fact is we don't know. Maybe it's a little bit of both. I don't know. Here's a question though. What if aliens actually are every bit as dangerous and annoying as we are? I hardly ever hear anyone even mention this possibility. Why is it so outrageous to consider? Why do so many people in the UFO community seem to work on the unspoken assumption that the extraterrestrials are all or mostly all good? Seriously. It seems to me very possible that the old idea of heaven and angels has just been transmuted in a secular age and grafted onto the character of alien beings. Seems that way to me, quite possibly. Maybe some of them are good. Maybe some of them are even better than we are, ethically or however. And maybe there are reasons to think that they aren't. The point is, considering these objects as a potential threat is entirely reasonable and does not automatically lead to a conclusion that this is a psyop. But let's look at more evidence. Let's look at the last 3.5 years of media messaging and public opinion. So one thing we do know about false flags is how the media messaging goes. This is clear. So something major and horrible happens, right? Something traumatic and shattering, a big event. And the media messaging that follows hits you over the head like a hammer with a single message that is designed to incite you to some form of action. It's unified across all establishment media, and there is never a doubt as far as what you're supposed to think. And also, that process is fast. We're talking days and weeks. We're not talking years. But here, in this case, look around. If we're dealing with a false alien threat narrative, who is actually scared? It's been 3.5 years. Who in the media has been peddling an alien threat narrative? As far as I can see, absolutely no one is doing this. Of all the major mainstream voices that discuss UFOs at all, probably the most prominent of them would be Tucker Carlson over at Fox. I don't think he has ever truly promoted such a narrative. And the same you could say for the people over at CNN, for that matter, or any other major network. And the New York Times articles, ditto. Yes, the New York Times articles have described some interesting and disturbing military encounters with UFOs, but even there, the threat narrative just wasn't there. No, I mean, what we're getting is a different narrative, that this phenomenon appears to be real. That's the narrative, that UFOs are real. And it's a narrative that is working its way into our culture very slowly, but definitely. And even that is not being done with any sort of uniform, consistency. Even today, a lot of the establishment media still resists that conclusion. We're not getting anything like a uniform message on this, in my view, not even close. And now we have this UAP Task Force Report. So you would think that if there were a true attempt to play up an alien threat narrative, right, if this were actually happening, that you would see some evidence of it in this report. And instead, you get the opposite, or very nearly so, frankly. And in fact, think about it. The report doesn't even use the phrase national security threat. No, it doesn't. It uses the laughably bureaucratic expression, national security challenge. Perfect for our time. I mean, honestly, our officials are constantly watering down language in ways that make reality less vivid, less understandable, and all of this for political reasons, obviously. And you see it in this case. The report very briefly mentions UAP as a possible national security challenge because it specifically chose to avoid the word threat. That was a deliberate choice. And it was a choice designed to tone down the whole situation, not ramp it up, but tone it down, which is, if this were an alien threat narrative that were being promoted, you would expect the opposite. You would expect them to ramp it up if this were a psyop in that way or a false flag or something like that. But no, what we got was the opposite. We got them definitely downplaying it. Now, if anything, that's the psyop. That's the psyop. In other words, there is a psyop when it comes to UFOs. There always has been. And that psyop, frankly, remains in place to this day. And that psyop is to downplay and to dismiss UFOs as much as possible. This was the case a decade ago. This has not changed. This has not changed. People are surprised to hear this maybe because we're hearing about UFOs so much in the news. But I'm telling you, it hasn't changed. The desire to throw cold water all over this subject is just as strong as it ever has been. But it's also true that many of us, myself included, were confused for a while, especially after the New York Times wrote those first 2 articles about UFOs back in 2017. Yes, that was confusing. And that's because, well, I mean, I think by now, pretty much any educated person realizes that the New York Times is a dishonest tool of propaganda for the ruling establishment of this country. They're America's version of Pravda, which, you know, the old Soviet Union has. They're the so-called journal of paper of record. Well, the journalistic crimes of that paper of record should justifiably be enough to force it to shut its doors forever, in my opinion, and good riddance, I would say. So anyway, back in December 2017, when this newspaper, which had been positively embarrassingly awful on UFOs ever since the 1940s. So suddenly in December 2017, they do a 180 and they put out 2 decent articles on UFOs that essentially attested to the reality of UFOs. So we read this, naturally, we're all confused. I was confused. I'm wondering what's really going on here. This can't be right. There's got to be something else going on. And again, many of us, and again, myself included, we talked about some form of controlled UFO disclosure. In fact, I explicitly used that phrase, controlled disclosure, in one of my earlier YouTube videos about this. But I would say that enough time has passed now. And I do think that we can see this situation with a little bit more clarity. So what I now believe, and I believe this for quite some time, and I especially believe this after studying all of the articles that have come out by the New York Times specifically, what I now believe is that there is a definite pattern. Because not all of the articles of the New York Times really had much of interest to say about UFOs. No. Only those written by Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal have actually been of genuine value. And there are a bunch of other articles on UFOs that came out by other journalists in the New York Times. And every one of those reverts back to the traditional, ignorant, and basically useless coverage that the Times has always had on UFOs. And the fact is that anyone who knows Leslie and Ralph at all also knows that they're not just sympathetic to UFOs. They're believers. They know it's real. They're very careful about saying this publicly, but it's definitely true. And they should be believers because they do know it's real, because it is real. Of course it's real. But it's them, Leslie and Ralph. They clearly fought to get their stories into the New York Times. And even then, they met with resistance. And this clearly hampered their ability to get the whole story out in some cases. And this is because there's still an establishment orthodox position in which UFOs are not supposed to be promoted. The fact that Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal have been able at all to get some decent UFO coverage in there is actually an amazing accomplishment. And they did this with allies, of course, most notably Christopher Mellon and Luis Elizondo and others. But that's what we're seeing. This is my view of it. I don't think the New York Times has changed with any significance on UFOs at all. But Leslie and Ralph knew they had a story back in 2017. They had the ATIP story and they had the Tic Tac story. And they were able to get those into the New York Times. Now, if someone has a better argument for how this all happened, well, they should present it. I'd like to hear it. So what this means is that we're seeing a battle take place. We're seeing a group of people who actively support some level of UFO disclosure. And I'm not talking about full disclosure of this incredible, astonishing situation, not even close. But there are clearly people who believe in getting some UFO information out to the public and to Congress. Are their motives pure and all good? I have no idea. And I doubt that you have any idea either. Do they want a piece of the Defense Department action? Sure, could be. I have no definite ideas, but why not? Wouldn't shock me. If it were true, though, ask yourself, would it invalidate the information that we've gotten from them so far? I wouldn't think so at all. But what we are seeing is a battle between a faction within the establishment against the rest of the establishment. That's what we're seeing. Look at all the twists and turns of the UAP story and saga over the last few years and ask yourself if any other scenario fits better. I don't think that any other scenario does fit better. And what the establishment desperately wants to keep doing is to bury this subject as deeply as possible, like it's done for years. This latest UAP Task Force Report is, in fact, it's a perfect representation of that effort. They're doing everything they can to go on the down low with this subject. The problem from their point of view is that they're just not quite able to do it the way they did in the past. That's what we're seeing. So you are not seeing a false flag psychological operation designed to give you fear of the aliens. Sorry, but you're not. There isn't a shred of evidence supporting this idea. But you are still supposed to go back to sleep and forget about UFOs. Yeah, that's the psyop. The problem is, as one scientist insider told me a couple of years ago, is that too much toothpaste is now out of the tube. The thing is, our establishment is not monolithic. All right. People often make this mistake, in my view. They assume everything that comes out is part of one group. And it's just not, it's not true. There is a powerful centralized group that does seek to control everything it can. But that control is not 100%, not even today. There are definitely divergent groups that exist. And not all dissent has been shut down. Our establishment is not monolithic. There are always factions and always points of disagreement. What we are seeing now is a battle being fought over this subject, that is of UFOs. And it's a battle, by the way, that can still very much be lost if the rest of us do go back to sleep. So that's something we don't want to do. All right. Well, that's what I got for you now. So once again, if you support what I do, please press that like button. Consider subscribing to my YouTube channel here. Click on notifications so you don't miss a new show. And if you really want to see what I'm up to on a regular basis, do go to richarddolanmembers.com, which is where I produce content every week. Articles, audio, video, the whole thing. I want to thank everyone for showing up here. I want to say hi to the chat family. I see you guys in there. As you know, it's impossible for me to comment while the show's going on. I can't do those two things at once, but I'm very grateful that you're all here, and I appreciate everyone's support. It means a lot to me. It truly does. Thank you. And that's it for now. So thanks for being here with me, and hey, let's keep fighting the good fight. Later.